Hi, welcome to SQL in the City Streamed. I hope you're having a great day. My name's Alex and I'm going to talk about database DevOps anti-patterns, or as I like to call it, how to screw up your ability to deliver SQL changes in 15 simple steps. A little bit about me before we get started. I worked for 6 years for Redgate as a pre-sales engineer, helping organizations to set up database DevOps. And then earlier this year, I left Redgate to start my own company, DLM Consultants, where I still help organizations to implement database DevOps. So I've been doing this for a good long while. And this presentation is kind of born out of some of my experience going into organizations and trying to bring about database DevOps. My Twitter handle is @_Alex Yates_. The hashtag for the event is #SQL in the City. Please do ask me questions on that hashtag. I will respond. If there's time at the end of the session, I'll try and respond there. But given it's only a half-hour session, I think it's more likely I'll be responding on Twitter or Slack or Slido or wherever you've asked the questions after the session has finished. I'm also going to be tweeting my references. So throughout this presentation, I reference various blog posts or documentation pages and things. I'm going to be live tweeting those, so do pay attention to that for all of the links and things as we go. So before we get started, before we start talking about how you can screw up your ability to deliver updates, I thought it's probably a good idea to say what is it we're actually trying to do in the first place. Now, many of us will have our own opinions about database DevOps, and 10,000 deploys a day might not be suitable for everybody, but that's what Alistair Hahn from Skyscanner is on a journey towards. He's got a really good blog series that starts at the tweet that I've just tweeted. It starts with from a position where they're doing 20 deploys a year, then it came down to 10 deploys a year, and then he talks about the journey, hopefully up to eventually 2 million deploys a year. It's a really interesting read, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. But the way I like to think about database DevOps is cycle time. And this comes from a conversation I had with Dave Farley, so I can't take the credit for it. It's a conversation I had with Dave Farley after Pipeline a couple of years ago. And he said that actually the only thing that matters is cycle time. How quickly can you go from idea to code, to tested code, to production, to feedback from production, to your next idea? What's that cycle? And when I ask most people, they say it's either measured in weeks or months. Okay? If that's measured in weeks or months, it takes you a long time to deliver that update to your customer. Actually, if we can measure that time in days or hours or minutes, then at that point we can become a lot more responsive to the business and our customers' needs. And that's what a lot of the most successful organizations are doing. So if our sole drive is cycle time, how quickly can we go from idea to code, to tested code, to production, to feedback on that idea? How quickly can we do that? All of the rest of the stuff kind of works itself out, because it's kind of necessary. If that's what you're going to do, it's necessary to sort out source control, continuous integration, automated builds, automated releases. That kind of all works itself out if the sole focus is cycle time. So that's my view. It may be different from yours, but in general, trying to improve that cycle time is what we're all about today. So how can we screw that up? Well, number one is fearing every change, okay? So data folk and DBAs in particular, and I love them for this, are very, very cautious and risk-averse people. They've got to look after the data. If there's a problem with the data, the buck stops with them, okay? If I was to hire a DBA, I would be looking for the most paranoid control freak with severe OCD, because I would not want them to muck up any of my deployments. I would not want them to leave a stone unturned when thinking about how to manage the data. The issue is that deployments, by their very nature, involve some level of risk. And if we are afraid of every single deployment, and we're afraid of these new ideas about continuous integration, spinning up test databases all over the place, deploying automatically to production, if we're afraid of that stuff, then that can actually hold us back in a big way. So we need to avoid that fear of change. We need to actually take that cautious and risk-averse nature and embrace it and apply it to testing out the new stuff. If you're going to bring up some new automation to deploy to production, take that skepticism and really analyze the automation process and work out how that can go wrong, work out what's going to go wrong with that. So number one is a fear of change. If you want to completely screw your ability to deliver database updates, fear every change. And that leads to number two, wait until you're already screwed. Okay? If you I've been to a lot of organizations, both with Redgate and DLM Consultants, where I've come in and they've got some horrible legacy database where they change something over here and something over there broke unexpectedly. You've probably worked with databases like that as well. It's really, really horrible to work in that sort of environment because you're afraid of every single change and you get the blame a lot, often when it's not necessarily your fault. Okay? So in these sorts of environments that things like source control, being able to keep track of who changed what and when, continuous integration, automated testing, making sure the thing hasn't broken, automated releases so that I can deploy that code reliably, quickly, and easily. That sort of stuff sounds really, really valuable in the context of a legacy horrible system. The problem is that to implement source control and CI and release management and so on, in order to implement that, you need to learn a whole load of new concepts, a whole load of new skills, a whole load of new technologies. Git is really complicated for somebody who's just trying to pick this up for the first time. So trying to learn all of that new stuff at the same time as applying it to your complicated legacy system, that's really hard. And that causes a lot of people to fall over when they try and implement DevOps. The irony is they've got a greenfield project over here. There's a sort of project that everybody wants to work on. It's brand new, it's easy to work with. They don't really feel the problems, they don't really see the need for testing and automated deployment yet because everything's so easy there anyway. The issue is that actually if you want to implement database DevOps, do it there first because you're going to have a lot more success with it. You're going to be building that project from the beginning in a testable, deployable format. You're going to build those tests with the project, so it's not going to turn into, or at least not as quickly going to turn into, one of these horrible legacy systems. And what's more, if you apply it there first, you've then built up the skills and the knowledge and the experience with these technologies, and you're going to have a lot more success than applying it with the legacy system. So if you want to screw up, attack the legacy complicated database first and ignore all the easy stuff that would be a lot easier to have your first experience with DevOps with. Step 3, let's imagine that you've just got this big, horrible, legacy complicated system. Let's imagine that's where you're already at. What's wrong with it? Well, the most common thing that I see that's wrong with these systems is where people have a complicated web of dependencies. This database depends on that database, depends on this database, which depends back on circular dependencies. It's horrible. One of the principles of DevOps is that I should be able to take any version of source code and deploy it, build it on my machine, on production, wherever. I should be able to deploy that easily. If I need to, in order to deploy that database, build 100 different databases in a complicated order, I'm actually not sure what the dependency network if I go into an organization and I ask them to draw a dependency diagram of all of their databases, if they can't do that, good luck being able to spin up those databases on demand. Now, you're not completely doomed if you do have a complicated web of dependencies. There are various techniques, and Peter and Chris from Redgate have put out a really good blog post that I've just tweeted about how various different strategies for handling this. But try and avoid this if you can. If you can, take those dependencies into the application tier so you don't need to worry about it in the database layer. But let's imagine you're stuck in this situation. You're then deploying to production. Let's think about those production databases. Now, this isn't going to apply to everybody, but it applies to a lot of people, so I thought it's worth putting it in. What if your production database isn't the same everywhere? You've got lots of different production databases and lots of different environments, okay? And what if, let's say you deploy to different customers, one customer asks you for a special hotfix change. They want some customization because they've got some special requirement that none of your other customers have, and you build it for them, which requires custom database updates. Now, I've worked with customers, and there's one customer I'm thinking of in particular, and he knows exactly who he is if he's watching. My thoughts are with you. He started out with 3 or 4 customers that he was deploying to as a small company. At that point, every extra customer they could get in was really important for their company because they were new and they were just starting out. And of course, they bent over backwards for every customer. They did whatever they wanted, whatever each customer wanted, they did it to make sure they kept them happy, to make sure they kept the business. Well, as it turns out, it was a phenomenally successful company. They've now got 3,000 customers. 3,000 customer databases. Now, fortunately, at some point they realized the problem, so 2,500 of them are actually in a standard state, and those guys are the lucky ones because they can continue to be supported, they can continue to be maintained. But there's that long tail of all of their oldest, most loyal customers who have got these complicated database hotfixes which render their database different from all of the other databases. Every single developer that's now developing has to think not just about the standard image that's deployed to most people, but another 500 different versions of production. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. It doesn't scale. Don't do it. Okay? What you should do, if you possibly can, standardize so everybody has exactly the same version. If a customer asks you for a special fix, make that your next feature for everybody and deliver it to everyone. If they have some special custom fix in the application code that requires an extra column or something, deploy that column everywhere. Make sure you have the same standard database everywhere. It doesn't matter if you deploy a table with a column with a table with a column that isn't used. It doesn't matter, okay? Just make sure you have the same standard database with every single customer, because I promise you it's going to be a lot easier to manage, maintain, test, and release moving forward. But let's think about, so that's in production. You can have different versions running in production. What about in development? You heard from Bob Walker earlier. He was from Farm Credit Services of America, and they described their own development environment as the Wild West. You had one big database with all the different there are 14 different development teams, all working on different projects on the same set of databases, and some of them were using source control, some of them weren't. Those that were using source control were using various different approaches. And what they would do is they would package together all of these scripts or packages or a single script and give it to the DBA. That's John Morehouse, the guy on the left in this image. As a production DBA, he would be given a script or a set of scripts or a package or something, and he'll be told, here you go, deploy that live, it needs to be up there by the end of the day. That's in 2 hours. And this has got 2 weeks worth of development from a full team of people. He also isn't aware of exactly how it's all structured because all the different teams do it in different ways. He wants to get home to his kids this evening, but he's going to struggle to get there given the complicated nature of the thing he's been asked to do. What's far better, and so myself and one of my colleagues at the time at Redgate flew over to Farm Credit to help them get set up initially and start that journey. Bob has actually written about the visit and the journey that they went on in a really great blog post that's well worth a read, that's gone out on the Twitter feed. So what they did is they standardized, so everybody used the same source control system. They standardized to Git and Redgate SQL source control. As a result, all the 14 different development teams started working in the same way. They started to be able to understand what each other were doing, and crucially, the DBA team and the dev team were able to work together much more efficiently because they could understand what each other were doing. They could understand how each other were working. So do standardize that process. But, and here's the rub, when we came up with this process, and what we did here is we had a focus group from left to right. You've got production DBA, architect, application developer, me and my colleague, and then a database developer. So you've got a cross-functional team going on here working on this together, applying all of the DBA and developer concerns all the way along. We came up with a proof of concept, and then before we left, we involved everybody. And this is right at the beginning of their process. We involved everybody. We said, look, this is what we've come up with. And everybody in the engineering floor came into one big meeting and they tore it apart and gave us a whole bunch of things to go away and think about. By involving everybody, everybody felt like they owned it a bit. The worst thing you can do is impose some new process on the people, on your end users, the people that actually have to implement it for you. This is a clip from a film called Office Space, which was out in the 90s, which is just a catalogue of every poor management style you can see. It's a hilarious film. I promise you should go watch it. There's a clip from it that I've tweeted on YouTube there. Do not just come to your developers and force them to work a certain way. I've certainly had people do that to me in the past. It didn't go well. Maybe I wasn't as professional as I should have been, but hey, we're all humans. I didn't feel very appreciated when I was being told to work in a very, very different way, a way that I fundamentally disagreed with. And your users won't like it either, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So make sure you involve people and treat people right. And when you do want to roll out a process, make sure you give them the tools and the training that they need to be able to succeed. Step 7 in my catalogue of things that you can do to avoid to screw up your ability to deliver database updates is to say to all of your team, here's a process, but I'm not going to explain properly how it's going to work. I've given you a tool, use it. You've got a tool now, right? No, you actually need to give people the time and the training and the coaching to understand not just the technical kind of how this works, but also the why. What is the point in DevOps? Why should I care about this thing? Why do I need to work with the DBA team as a developer? We do different things, right? You need to explain it to people. You need to give people the time, the training, and the coaching to actually be able to have success rolling these things out. So talked a lot about coming up with some process and applying it, but there are actually a couple of different ways that we can do this. Fundamentally, they're kind of two very different approaches. Earlier on this Earlier on today, we heard about from Mickey Stew about SQL source control. It's a state or a model or a declarative-based version control system. You define what you want at each step, and then typically you generally let software work out the updates. Just before me, you heard from Steve Jones talking about ReadyRoll. It's a migrations-based approach. You create one upgrade script, another upgrade script, another upgrade script. You run them in sequence, and that's how you handle your deployments. So you've got this kind of model approach and this migrations approach. Hippo's famous advocates of database DevOps, they have strong opinions just like we do. And I'm going to try and demonstrate those different opinions now. So this is actually Paul Stovall, smart guy, one of our friends at Octopus Deploy. This is something that he wrote in one of their documentation pages that's just gone out on the tweet. There's nothing more reliable than keeping track of exactly the scripts you intend to run and running them without trying to compare state and guess. What he's saying is that use a migrations-based approach, because what you're going to do is you're going to run exactly the same scripts in the same order, in the same way on every single one of your environments. You cannot get more reliable than that. Run the same scripts on your test environment, good. The same ones on your staging environment, the same ones on production. Once you've done all of that, you know that the deployment is more or less going to work in the same way on production. It's reliable. It's easy. It's an easy concept to understand. He's right. The problem is, while that's great for automation, it struggles to scale with teams who are large teams trying to work together, especially large distributed teams. Gert Drapers, who's Microsoft guy, he's a guy who was behind DataDude, and that later became Visual Studio Database Projects and SSDT. What he said is that as soon as you have multiple changes on a single aspect of an object, ordering and the ability to detect which change needs to be made gets very complicated. He's right. I mean, we all know if we've had to create upgrade scripts or manage deployments in the past, there's a certain order to the way we need to deploy our objects based on the object type and dependencies and things. So it's really, really important to get that right. Also, if you're just source controlling a bunch of update scripts, it's very hard to see if two people have changed the same object, and you can have conflicts. So it can get really, really complicated to manage once you hit a certain scale, once you've got lots of developers committing lots of times a day. So in many ways, migrations tools like ReadyRoll solve the problems of automation a lot better, but state-based tools like Redgate SQL Source Control solve the problems associated with team-based development an awful lot better. So there is this natural conflict. I've tried to summarize here. Small teams who make few changes and have few programmable objects, stored procedures, functions, views, etc., are well suited to migrations. That's because migrations are particularly good at handling complicated data migrations that need to be handled in a very particular way. And if you're not making very many changes, it's not as hard to keep track of the order. So migrations works well in that scenario. Otherwise, if you've got large teams, if you've got lots of stored procedures, declarative models work better. Someone really smart said that. I forget who it was. So do think about your model or your migrations process carefully. Do consider which is going to be right for your team and pick the appropriate one. Okay. And don't, well, if you want to screw up your ability to deliver database updates, then go ahead and hotfix production. Do it to your heart's content, because all that's going to happen then is you're going to run a different version in production to what you've got in dev. Ever heard anyone say it works on my machine? I have. Okay, that's because I'm working in a development and test domain against a different version of the code that's running in production. The production version has not been through the tests. That's crazy. Don't do that, okay? Now, the reason why we do that, and I understand why we do it, because there's a burning issue on production that's costing $1 gazillion a second. We have to get that fixed out right away. And remember what I said about cycle time. It's months to go from idea to code to tested code to production. If that takes months, of course I'm going to make it directly on the production database, because the production database needs to be fixed right now. But if I can do that in minutes, I don't need to make that change on production anymore. I can make the change in source control and I can run my automated tests on it, I can automate the deployment of it, and it's gone. I don't need to make the change directly on production anymore. So invest in DevOps so that you can stop committing that cardinal sin of hotfixing stuff directly on production. Now, how does that actually work? Well, step 10 in my catalog of ways to screw your ability to deliver database updates is to never ever use branches. There are some really, really good there's some really, really good benefits to using branches, and one of them is that hotfix scenario. Let me walk you through a scenario. So you've developed version 10 and you've deployed that to production. Good. You then do a bit more development. You get up to version 15. That's the latest version in source control. And then a user reports an error. You discover there's a problem on production, and it's quite serious. You need to solve that problem immediately. Well, how can we fix that on production without hotfixing it directly on production? How can we do that from source control if we're up to version 15? Well, what we need to do is we need to go back, we need to check out version 10, we need to branch that, make our fix in source control, run our tests, then we can deploy that to production using your tried and tested, reliable, automated deployment process. And then once everybody stopped panicking, once the fire is put out, we can then take that code and we can merge it back into line with mainline. That's a really good example of how branching can help us solve problems. So do invest in branching, and this has a consequence. And one of the things they said is, effectively, when you create a branch, you have to be able to provision a new database. You have to provision a new environment to be able to do that work on that branch. And remember what I said about those cross-database dependencies? It's really important to be able to spin up your environments in a dev environment or a test environment on demand. So make sure it's easy to do that. All of these different anti-patterns, they all kind of intertwine with each other to create a horrible, horrible solution where it's really, really difficult to do any development. So do make sure it's easy to provision an environment out of the box, and make sure that you do look at the branching functionality of the source control system that you decide to use. Make sure you understand how to use it, and also how to avoid screwing up with it. There are a lot of people that read Vincent Dryson's excellent blog post, which has gone out on the Twitter feed, a successful Git branching strategy. It's a fantastic blog post. It talks to you through exactly the various different use cases for branching, why you might use them in some scenarios, why you might not use them in other scenarios. And that's really, really useful. It begins to help you understand why you might want to do branching. The mistake people make is they read that and then they go and make all of the branches all over the place without any real strategy to it. Branching is easy. Merging back in can be very, very difficult if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't have any real strategy to it, and crucially, if you've gone a long time. If you create a dev branch and then do 6 months of work on that and then try and merge that back in, well, good luck. You're going to have all sorts of conflicts where you've changed some objects, other people have changed the same objects on mainline. It's going to be a right nightmare. So be very, very careful with branching. What you should do as an entire team, all of you working on the same source code, you should all have the same strict policy on when you are going to branch, why you are going to branch, and most importantly, when you are going to merge back in. And you're going to do that as quickly as you possibly can. I don't like it when I see teams branching for a sprint, which may be 2 or 3 weeks. You've got a different branch for an entire sprint, and then you try and merge that back in. If you've got a lot of work going on those 2 different branches for 3 weeks, that's a hard, complicated merge. So try and keep the various branches as aligned as we possibly can. So step 11, to screw your ability to deliver databases, create a billion different branches, forget what the strategy was, and then have trouble aligning, bringing it all back together, because that's just wasted work. Work sitting on a branch that hasn't been merged back with master, it doesn't exist yet. So use lots of branches. Number 12, just don't do this. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are source control systems, CI systems, release management systems, database tools. I've seen people that have built them all themselves. People who have built their own source control. Why would you build your own source control system in this day and age? There's Git. If you don't like Git, there's TFS. If you don't like TFS, there's Subversion or Mercurial or Perforce. Or there are all sorts of source control systems out there, all sorts of build systems, all sorts of release management systems. Of course, we only want to use Redgate tools, SQL in the City. But there are tools out there that exist, and each one of these tools has probably got a team of maybe a dozen people on it that's been working on it for years. I promise you, I really do. They've solved problems that you haven't yet, and they're going to do a better job in the years with dozens of people of fixing all of the bugs that you've not thought of than you're going to be able to create in an afternoon as a side project. When people start building their own deployment frameworks, and I've seen it, they end up with these horrible legacy deployment frameworks that they then need to maintain alongside the actual product that they want to be spending their time building. Are you a database tools vendor? Are you a source control tools vendor? Probably not. So focus on whatever it is that you do. Focus on whatever it is you build. Become the experts in that. And I promise you, it's going to be a lot less expensive than the few $100s or even a couple of $1,000s per head to buy in the software to solve the problems that aren't your area. So with the greatest possible respect, just don't reinvent the wheel. I promise you it's not worth it. Apart from anything else, it's not going to scale with your business, and so it's not going to scale with your business, and maintaining it is going to become properly expensive. At Redgate, we made this mistake ourselves. We built our own CRM system. It's because we didn't like the options that were available at the time. They all seemed very complicated. So Neil Davidson, in the way that he was fantastic, one of our old joint CEO, one of the founders, he went away one evening, he said, I'll build us a CRM system. He came back the next morning and there was a CRM system. It worked. It was ingeniously simple. It was wonderful and simple to use. But it didn't scale with our business, and we ended up having to, we had like a whole team working on it full time to maintain this thing. We eventually had to have a migration when we had to buy in an industry standard tool. So yeah, just don't reinvent the wheel. I promise you it's not worth it. I've been there myself, both at Redgate and externally, so just don't do it. And do not have a functional standoff. Step 13 on my tip of all the things you can do to screw up your ability to deliver database updates is to have functional standoff. It's called DevOps for a reason. When I speak to developers and say DevOps isn't their problem, it's the DBA's problem, it irks me. When I speak to DBAs and they say DevOps isn't a DBA problem, it's a dev problem, it irks me. It's both. The whole point is you need to collaborate. That's the entire point. You need to work together on these release pipelines, dev and ops. You have different skills, you have different expertise, and it takes both of those sets of skills and expertise to be successful with database DevOps. So do work together. The worst thing you can possibly do, and I've seen this a lot as well, is create a DevOps team or a DevOps role to sit in the middle. What you end up with is an additional team. The whole problem you had initially was you had two different silos. Congratulations, you've just created a third silo that's going to manage all of the DevOps stuff so that developers and DBAs don't need to worry about DevOps anymore. It doesn't work. It's probably a little bit of an oversimplification. Actually, Matthew Skelton, and that's the person who I borrowed this slide from, thank you for letting me use it, Matthew. Matthew Skelton has got a really cool website called devopstopologies.com, and through his extensive experience implementing DevOps and continuous delivery, he talks about the various different models that work in organizations and what doesn't. So do go there and read more. The final thing that people do is they give up. I've heard all of the excuses. We're too big, we're too small, we're too regulated, we're too unregulated. They use opposite excuses for this. On the regulated point, who do you think are the biggest, most complicated regulatory systems, organizations with the hardest problems? Amazon, maybe? Amazon, who have an enormous business, they're massive, and they transact sales in all the different countries in the world and all the different legal systems, okay? They're some of the biggest, largest, most complicated organizations are the ones that are doing an awesome job with DevOps. I've personally been working with financial organizations, with healthcare organizations, so I promise you, it's not too difficult for you. You should adopt DevOps. Please persevere with it. So in summary, I've provided a list of 15 things that you shouldn't do because they'll screw up your ability to deliver database updates. What I'm going to do to summarize is I'm going to spin that round and I'm going to talk about 15 things that you should do, 15 good practices, things that you should try and do in order to be able to deliver databases. Embrace change, but do it carefully. Adopt DevOps early before you have the problems that you're going to face. Avoid cross-database dependencies and standardize your production instances. As well, standardize the way you do development. And make sure that when you do standardize that process, involve everybody and provide training. Make sure you provide the right model or migration solution for your project. Avoid production hotfixes. Use branching appropriately. And don't overuse it. Use industry standard solutions where they're available. Work collaboratively across your silos, structure yourself for success, and persevere with it. Because I promise you, the benefits are going to be significant to your organization. Thanks very much for listening. My name's Alex Yates. I'm from DLM Consultants. You've got all of my contact details on the screen there. We provide online and on-site training and consultancy. If you would like to work with me, I realize most of you are in the States and I'm in the UK. I actually already have 2 planned trips over to the US, possibly in H1 next year. So please do talk to me if you'd like my help. implementing this stuff. One final thing, a lot of the references that I've tweeted throughout this talk, I've summarized them all at www.dlmconsultants.com/SITC. That's SITC for SQL in the City. So if you want to read more about any of the points that I've mentioned, go to www.dlmconsultants.com/SITC. Thanks very much. I hope you're enjoying SQL in the City streamed, and I'm looking forward to answering all of your questions on Twitter. Thank you.